Hello again, 102. Continuing with the 1920s in chapter 22, we'll discuss Prohibition and begin talking about the Republican resurgence of the 1920s and what were some of the challenges and side effects of banning booze, the 18th Amendment, which is in effect for those 13 years. It was the national ban on the manufacture and sale of alcohol, and although the law was widely violated, and it proved too difficult to enforce effectively. And this was pushed through by rural, small-town Protestants and urban political progressives, an unusual grouping, but they believed that these and nativist movements they shared many of the same ethnic and social prejudices. And the head of the Anti-Saloon League, for example, declared that German Americans eat like gluttons and drink like swine. Prohibition just about put my family out of business because we were in the beer business growing up in Tonawanda, New York, and this severely affected my family. And for many anti-alcohol crusaders, in fact, the primary goal of Prohibition seemed to be policing the behavior of the foreign-born, the working class, the poor, and blacks. Prohibition was thus the law during the 1920s, but it was not widely followed. As the most ambitious social reform ever attempted in the United States, this is social engineering, ladies and gentlemen. It proved to be a colossal and costly failure. It was too sweeping for the government to enforce and too frustrating for most Americans to respect, and it had many consequences not widely foreseen. The loss of liquor taxes, for example, cost the federal government almost 30% of its annual revenue, and the closing of breweries, distilleries, and saloons eliminated thousands of jobs. And it's all fair in drinking war. Here's an elaborate scheme to try to avoid the Volstead Act enforcers, and they used torpedoes to get bootleg whiskey to shore. Wow. Many of the activities associated with the Roaring Twenties were fueled by bootleg liquor supplied by organized crime and sold in illegal saloons called speakeasies, which were often ignored by local police corrupted by bribes. New York City's police commissioner estimated that there were 32,000 speakeasies in the city in 1929, and there was 15,000 legal saloons only in 1919. And popular singer Bessie Smith openly proclaimed, "Any bootlegger sure is a pal of mine." Although total national alcohol consumption did decrease during the 20s, in many parts of the nation, drinking actually increased. Because now it's a trendy thing to do, right? It goes back to these ideas of relativism and the change in the morality of the country in the aftermath of the Great War. And as popular humorist Will Rogers quipped, "Prohibition is better than no liquor at all." And this turned many Americans into criminals, the most famous being Alphonse Scarface Capone, who brought in $60 million a year, over $1 billion in today's dollars, much of which he spent bribing police officials, judges, and politicians. One barrel of beer in the late 20s would go for $100 a barrel. Wow. This guy made all kinds of money. And in a famous 1987 movie details the exploits of Capone. Robert De Niro plays Capone. Kevin Costner plays Elliot Ness, the FBI agent sent to try to arrest Capone. Sean Connery is one of his helpers. Charles Martin Smith is also another good actor in this movie from Hollywood. Well worth a look. Capone was a ruthless character. He would murder people that tried to oppose his empire. And he became so notorious, even though he viewed himself as being a modern Robin Hood, because he gave a lot of money away also. But again, he crushed all of his rivals and his own capons that were going to turn him in. And there's a famous scene in that Hollywood movie where he bludgeons two people to death with a baseball bat. This attracted the attention of President Hoover, and he asked Secretary of the Treasury Mellon, "Have you got this fellow Capone yet? I want that man in jail." And Mellon decided that the best hope for prosecuting the notorious mobster was to prove that he never paid taxes, income taxes, on his ill-gotten gains. And federal law enforcement officials, led by the dynamic agent named Elliot Ness, smashed Capone's bootlegging operations in 1929. Soon thereafter, Ness, having refused bribes from Capone, he's untouchable, charged the crime boss with tax evasion. And eventually he's tried and found guilty in 1931. Capone spent most of the next 13 years in federal prison. He was at Alcatraz, out in San Francisco Bay, and bankrupt and helpless. He died in 1947 of degenerative syphilis contracted years before in one of his own brothels. Crime does not pay. This leads in now to the last question, the Republican resurgence in the 1920s. Harding and his word that he coined, the return to normalcy. And Woodrow Wilson himself, at the end of his term, recognized the shifting public mood. It is only once in a generation, he remarked, that a people can be lifted above material things. That is why conservative government is in the saddle 2/3 of the time. And in the election of 1920, Harding sets the conservative tone when he told a Boston audience that it was time to end Wilsonian progressivism. America needed not heroics, but healing. Not nostrums, but normalcy, his invented word. Not revolution, but restoration. Not agitation, but adjustment. Not surgery, but serenity. Not the dramatic, but the dispassionate. And Harding will pardon, as I mentioned in another video, he will pardon Eugene V. Debs, the socialist leader, and Debs will finally be let out of prison. In contrast to Wilson's internationalism, Harding, like Donald Trump almost a century later, promised to safeguard America first. This is a very effective campaign technique in American politics. Exalt America first, to live for and to revere America first. This is very effective. He polled 16 million votes to the Democrat James Cox out of Ohio, and who won no state other than the solid Democratic South, and the Republicans have the majority in both houses of Congress. Franklin Roosevelt, who was Cox's vice presidential candidate, he's only 38 years old in 1920. He had yet to contract polio at this point. He predicted that his Democratic Party could not hope to return to national power until the Republicans led the nation into a serious period of depression and unemployment. And he was right. Here's the Ohio gang that will help to really bring down any achievements of the Harding administration. These guys were corrupt individuals, many of them, and they weren't really fit to be doing their jobs. One person that Harding did appoint was Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon, and he was a very good appointment, along with Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes, as we'll see. And this is supply-side economics, ladies and gentlemen. Low tariffs, low government spending, and at this time, the traditional high Republican tariff. Throughout the 20s, with the support of Congress and Presidents Harding and Coolidge, Mellon's policies systematically reduced income tax rates while increasing tax revenues. The top annual tax rate was cut from 73% in 1921 down to 24% in 1929. Rates for the people with the lowest annual incomes were also cut substantially, thereby helping the working poor. By 1929, there were millions of people who didn't pay any income taxes at all. They didn't have to. And this plan worked. At the same time, they helped to reduce the federal budget, which was very high at the beginning of the decade. Government expenditures fell, as did the national debt, and the economy soared. Unemployment plummeted to 2.4% in 1923. Mellon's admirers tagged him the greatest Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton in the late 18th century. And in addition to tax cuts, again, he promoted the long-standing idea of high tariffs on imported goods. And that's going to be one of the causes of the Great Depression. Just to jump ahead a little bit, ladies and gentlemen, because it'll be retaliatory tariffs then by all countries, and eventually international trade is going to grind to a halt. Britain and France all through the 20s have difficulty competing in American markets. Therefore, they have trouble generating revenue by selling their goods. They can't sell enough, and they're not generating enough money to pay back the loans that Americans made them during the First World War. Germany will default on their reparations, resulting in more American loans to keep the German economy going. All of those things were contributing factors to the Great Depression. Some things that Harding did with commissions and court appointments and some other policies he advocated. Neither Harding or Coolidge will get rid of the regulatory agencies created during the Progressive era, but a technique that is used in the 20s and in conservative administrations ever since. They'll put people in charge who are business friendly. They're not going to be too strict on regulation or enforcement. And in addition, Harding's 4 Supreme Court appointees were all conservatives, including the former president, now Chief Justice William Howard Taft, who viewed himself as being appointed to reverse a few decisions, such as in child labor, and they strike down a minimum wage law for women, and they issue numerous injunctions against unions, as well as limiting the powers of federal regulatory agencies. And Harding is actually quite progressive when it comes to the race question, and he also attacks the Klan for promoting this race hatred and prejudice and violence. And he also urged Congress to get rid of lynching. We discussed that in an earlier video. But again, Southern Democrats are going to stop an anti-lynching bill. So Harding is very progressive, especially compared to the Southerner Wilson. And there's many setbacks for unions. The open shop comes in, which in theory implies that employers can hire anyone, whether they're a union member or not. But what the open shop does is discriminate against unions. And some employers, like Ford, will try to kill unions with kindness, with industrial democracy, or schemes of welfare capitalism. And George Pullman had tried that in the 19th century with ideas like company towns, Pullman, Illinois. Ford will come up with profit sharing and bonuses and pensions and trying to get recreational activities going as a way of keeping unions out. And as we'll see, Henry Ford despises unions. And here's the open shop defined. And this weakens unions, and in the long run it's going to diminish workers' rights because you're dealing with management as an individual only. And some other foreign policy and global economic interests. We became the chief banker as a result of the Great War, and now we've got investments and loans and worldwide connections. It's going to be hard to stay isolationist, even though that is the official policy of the 1920s. There will be attempts at disarmament, and the 5-Power Treaty will be negotiated at the Washington Naval Conference. It was one of the most dramatic moments in diplomatic history. It was the first disarmament treaty. The 5 powers, Britain, France, the United States, Japan, and Italy, will agree to stop their arms race in a couple of areas. And this effectively partitioned the world into spheres of influence. U.S. naval power is supreme in the Western Hemisphere, Japanese power for a time in the Western Pacific, and British power from the North Sea to Singapore. This is another example of realpolitik. And there's a picture of the conference but unfortunately it was only on battleships and small aircraft carriers. In these other vessels, this will continue on. And that's it for this particular version. One more video will conclude the Republican Resurgence and chapter 22, and that will then get us onto the next part of HI 102 online.